Hey, welcome to Heatspring Advanced PV. We're going to talk about Article 250, Grounding and Bonding of the National Electrical Code. First, let's talk a little bit about some terminology, grounding, bonding, grounded conductors, functionally grounded. Grounding is connecting to Earth, that big thing that we're sitting on right now, and bonding is connecting everything together. However, when we mean bonding, we say grounding all the time, even in the National Electrical Code. So if you have a grounding conductor, like an equipment grounding conductor, or a grounding electrode conductor, something that the grounding ends with a G, then that wire should be green, bare, or sometimes green with a yellow stripe. And these conductors also, conductors are wires, these conductors that end with a G, like the grounding electrode conductor or the equipment grounding conductor. And also we could say for grounding electrode conductor, we say GEC, that's connecting to a ground rod, and equipment grounding conductor, EGC. And those both end with a G when you talk about the word grounding ending with a G. And so they're not supposed to carry current, and they can be green, bare, or green with a yellow stripe. On the other hand, we can have a grounded conductor, and let's qualify that as a solidly grounded conductor as to a functionally grounded conductor. So a grounded conductor that's solidly grounded, a lot of times we call that a neutral, and that grounded conductor does carry current, and it can be white, gray, or 3 white stripes or 3 gray stripes. As we talked about when we were covering Article 200, grounded conductors. Then there is the functionally grounded, which we already talked about, and we will talk about more, and that is now the fuse grounded. And we talk about functionally grounded, anything that is 2017 NEC and later. So before 2017 NEC, we didn't have functionally grounded. And here are our EGCs and our GECs. So equipment grounding conductor, the EGC, that's for bonding the equipment together, so connecting it all together. And then the grounding electrode conductor, that's for connecting the system to ground, to earth, to the electrode. So the grounding electrode conductor, that's not as common as the equipment grounding conductor. So for most grid-tied PV systems, we are not doing grounding electrode conductors. It used to be that we had to do that, and it was kind of a pain. And fortunately, we don't have to do that too often anymore to have GECs, grounding electrode conductors. And that was the DC GEC, and we used to have to go over that over and over again. But now, with the National Electrical Code, they don't require us to do that. And we are going to talk more about that, especially when they lay it out in 690. And although the colors right here are red and green, these conductors themselves, as we just said before, can be green, can be bare, and once in a while, they're green with a yellow stripe. And that green with a yellow stripe, that was even in a NABCEP question once. Now here's something kind of interesting. This is for UL 1741, and I got this from a large SMA inverter, and they are talking about when it has to cut off, and this would have been for a fuse grounded system, and sometimes we still do use fuse grounding for larger inverters. So for between 100 and 250 kilowatts, you could have 4 amps of leakage currents. So that is current that is going down the equipment grounding conductor to the inverter through the fuse. So if you had a 1 amp fuse in these cases, it wouldn't work. So most people that used to do residential solar 10 years ago had 1 amp fuses in their inverters. And once in a while, if you have enough current, you can have a fuse that's upsized so much that it can't even catch the ground fault. So when it's like the boy who cried wolf. There was leakage currents. And what leakage currents are is you would just have some currents that would follow the ground way down that would go through the glass of the module. And if you have enough modules, there's enough leakage current that would be leaking through that glass that would get all the way through. We don't have to worry about that too much anymore, except when we're doing O&M these days, or some of the bigger PV systems. And so if you're going to do some O&M or work on some bigger PV systems, you might want to be a little bit more aware of this. Here are some images that I got from the website from ABB. That's a large company. I remember I was down in South Africa at a solar conference doing a talk, talking to somebody afterwards that worked for ABB, and his company was so big, they didn't just have a job that was somebody's house, they had a job that was a country. They were talking about electrifying an entire country, like, let's go make a grid. So that's a big time company. So let's take a look here, and we have a couple of different things here. And so this one has a fuse in the inverter. This is the old style. I like to call it fuse grounded right now. It's also a type of functional grounding. It's the old style 2014 NEC and earlier. It would be called the grounded inverter, or an inverter we would say with a transformer. And what we have here is we have negative connected to ground through a fuse. So if some current was leaking out of the glass of the modules or the wire that's going along the rails, and if every module had a milliamp is a thousandth of an amp. And so if you had 1,000 milliamps, that's an amp. So it does add up over time. For a smaller residential system, it didn't add up to anything significant, but on some bigger systems, there were actually some fires that people think were started by this type of an inverter, which is why we got to go and use these other kind of inverters right here. We used to call these kinds of inverters European inverters because they were using them a lot in Europe, but Americans, we were afraid of them. They were called ungrounded in the National Electrical Code, and ungrounded sounds kind of scary to somebody that's a traditional old-time electrician. However, since the formerly known as grounded inverters, now known as fuse grounded, functionally grounded inverters, there were some fires, and some of those fires didn't kill anybody that anybody's heard about, but it's just not good to be starting fires. And if it was a fire in a ground mount, it's probably not that big of a deal anyway if you're talking about a giant utility scale system, because they have so many checks in place. So then we started to adopt these inverters, and we called them ungrounded inverters, and we had to put a special label by the inverter that said, "Warning, ungrounded inverter." And that was kind of scary too. And we got rid of that warning sign also in the 2017 NEC when we started calling both of these types of inverters functionally grounded inverters. So it used to be that this type of inverter on the right, we would have, this is showing a negatively grounded inverter, because it's negatively grounded through the fuse. The fuse is connecting the grounding system to the negative. It used to be that we had to make this wire white here in the 2014 NEC and earlier. Then after the 2014 NEC, so in the 2017 NEC, 2020 NEC, this wire cannot be white anymore. And it used to be that we would never open up the circuit. We would treat this like a regular grounded conductor, and you don't open it up when you turn it off. That means you don't turn off the negative, you just turn off the positive to turn it off. Then once the 2017 and later versions of the NEC rolled along, then we were supposed to open up both of these. Another thing that's a little bit different is when we would put fuses in a combiner, which we don't see right here, but when there was fuses in a combiner, in the 2017 and after versions of the NEC, we only need to put fuses on one polarity. Earlier, we would put fuses on both polarities on this formerly known as ungrounded inverter, and we would put fuses on a single polarity on the formerly known as grounded inverter. There's a few different things. Now what we do is we do the same thing for both of these inverters. So we disconnect positive and negative. We put fuses on a single polarity, and we can use USE2 wire or PV wire. So in 2014 and earlier versions of the NEC, we could only use PV wire for these non-isolated inverters. So non-isolated is a word that we can use for the formerly known as ungrounded, formerly known as transformerless inverters. So these inverters that are non-isolated are cheaper, safer, and more efficient than these other inverters that are fuse grounded right here. And so as we look around here too, we could see EGC, that stands for equipment grounding conductor, DC grounding electrode right there. That is something that we don't often have to do these days, but we used to have to do. Older terminology for grounded and ungrounded inverters. So remember, once again, a grounded inverter, I call it a fuse grounded inverter right now. Both of these we call functionally grounded inverters. And for an ungrounded inverter, we used to call those transformerless inverters, but now the proper term to use is non-isolated inverter. The different types of way to detect ground faults. So right now what we're doing is we're doing on what's saying ungrounded systems right here. And this is called a residual current device. And what this pretty much does is it will just compare positive and negative and make sure that they're equal. It's sort of like a GFCI. It just makes sure your positive and your negative is in equal current. And then the other thing that's really good for finding the super sensitive for finding ground faults is the insulation test. So what an inverter does is when it wakes up in the morning, it will send out a quick pulse of voltage through the array and see how much leakage to ground there is through the insulation of the wire. And if there should be millions of ohms, that's mega ohms. Some people call it a mega test when they do a test like that. And the inverter will do an insulation resistance test every morning, and they can find milliamps of leakage current with this resistance test. It's so good at finding ground faults. Some people think it's too good at finding ground faults, and when they replace an old inverter with a new inverter, they can't get it to turn on because it's always finding a ground fault, because there's just a little bit of leakage going through that insulation of that wire. So when something like that does happen, usually what they'll end up having to do if they can't find the ground fault is just get into the inverter with a computer and change the settings a little bit so it's not so sensitive. Little article about ABB, since I was getting some of those images from ABB right here and right there, is ABB is a company. It's like I said, it's a big, huge company, but they sold their solar division. They paid $470 million to get rid of it. I wish they would have paid me $470 million to take it. So that's big business for you. I hope you have an MBA to understand all of this stuff, but I'm sure it makes the CEO richer. ABB bought an inverter company that was a pretty popular inverter company called Power One, and ABB bought them up quite a while ago. I remember the first ever inverter that I saw that had multiple MPPs on it, so like different inputs where I could put different lengths of strings, was the Power One inverter. And I was looking at it going, that's pretty neat. And then ABB bought them up. And I think what was happening is there was just a little bit of trouble with competing with Asia, trade wars, so on and so forth. And this is coming out of Zurich, so it's a European company, and they sold the business to an Italian company. They probably have a lot of warranty work to pay for over the years. Just kind of one of the things that happens as things break down, normal case of doing business for an inverter company. And so there you have it, $470 million. Also, if you wanted to read this article and some other things that I have up here, you can look at the URLs up at the top. So you can see there's a URL here, bottom of the page, URL right there. So different ways where you can read what we were doing here. Let's talk a little bit about grounding versus lightning protection. Kaboom! So grounding is in the NEC, but lightning protection is not part of the NEC. The NEC ignores lightning protection. Lightning protection is way different in different parts of the United States. So we have to take into consideration where we are. If you're in California or if you're in Florida, it's going to be a big deal in Florida, and lightning is not a big deal at all in California. I haven't seen a lightning bolt in California in years. And if I was in Florida, it would be more like, I haven't seen a lightning bolt in Florida in 5 minutes. And just remember that lightning protection is not part of the NEC. And sometimes it gets confused and people put things in the NEC that have to do with lightning, and then they get in trouble and they take it out of the NEC. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get into grounding electrodes in Article 690. They call it 690.47. Here is the standard for lightning protection. And so different places will adopt different things for lightning protection. And so if the state that you're in wants to, they can adopt NFPA 780 standard for the installation of lightning protection. We can see here that the 2020 version is only $67.50. And you can get digital or print. And so just remember that 780 you can get for lightning protection. And here's a little bit just about what lightning protection is we can see on this image on the left right here, there's a lightning rod. And so it's going to capture that lightning and it can bring it down to earth instead of going through your electrical system. So let's just think about what would happen if we instead connected this lightning rod to our PV system ground coming down there. Then all of a sudden we'd have lightning go through our PV system. So this is like a separate thing, a separate deal, where it's bringing that lightning down to earth without bringing it through our PV system. This is just kind of interesting here. There's my friend Ben Franklin. Yeah, I'm kind of old. Ben Franklin was a friend of mine, and he was flying a kite, discovering electricity. He's, by the way, invented positive and negative for electricity. Then here is Ben Franklin's lightning rod. And so Ben Franklin thought he knew about electricity, but according to the NEC, his lightning rod was not NEC compliant. This is just a picture right here showing you lightning density. And so there's a 5-year map for different densities of lightning. And we can see there is not much going on over here in the west, but then over here, this is the lightning capital of the world, Florida. Lots of lightning down there. Lots of people getting hit by lightning. You probably don't want to go swimming when it's kabooming. Kaboom! Let's talk a little bit about the single point of system grounding. And so for each system, and a transformer would separate a system, but for each system, you're going to have one point in that system where there's that single point of system grounding. If you are in a house right now and you feel like checking it out and you're not afraid of getting electrocuted, yeah, you should be afraid of getting electrocuted. Don't do is what I say. This is not a hands-on course. But anyway, just in case you did that anyway, if you took off the cover of your main service panel and you opened it up, you can look in there and you can see a place where there are green wires and white wires going to the same bus bar, the same connection point, and that would be your single point of system grounding. That's where your neutrals or your white wires are connected to your grounding wires or your green wires. So on that bus bar in there, you'll probably have one wire that's going to your electrode. That's the grounding electrode conductor, the GEC. And then you'll have a bunch of wires that are bare and green, and those ones are going to different devices and appliances. And those bare and green wires are your equipment grounding conductors, your EGCs. And then you'll have white wires that are going to your different loads. And those white wires, yes, we don't call those any kind of EGC things because we have already used those 3 letters enough. So we call those neutrals, or we call them grounded conductors. And so you could see going to every plug socket in the wall would be coming from a circuit breaker somewhere, and it would be a white wire, a green wire, and a hot wire going to that place in your wall. So besides a transformer qualifying something as a separate system, so if you had a big building and you had different transformers changing the voltages in your giant big building that you're putting solar on, that would be one way of doing things. But another thing is if you have multiple surfaces, like you have a building with different tenants and things like that, then in that case, you also can have multiple points of system grounding. So it's like having a separate system if you have, say, a separate meter. And even a supply side connection, sometimes known as a line side tap, but more correctly known as a supply side connection, when you're hooking up solar, which we're going to learn a whole lot about in 705.11. That's 2020 NEC is 705.11. 2017 NEC is 705.12a. Anyway, supply side connection is connected like a service oftentimes. And so you could separately bond your neutral to ground separately when you're doing a supply side connection. Although solar is not considered a service, so even when you are doing a supply side connection, it is not a service, and you're not required to follow Article 230 services, which we already covered a bit, except for where it directs you to Article 230. It wasn't too many videos ago that we looked at this image, but it's kind of a good image I like for showing you a separate system, single point of system grounding. So here's the single point of system grounding. Hopefully you didn't get electrocuted in your house going in there. Make sure you wear gloves. And that's where all the electrodes are connected and all the equipment grounding conductors. So this is right there. That is going to an electrode. That's a water pipe electrode. That is called a grounding electrode conductor, a GEC. Here's an equipment grounding conductor that's going to the sub panel we're going to the sub panel right there, and we only have a single point of system grounding here. We don't have a point of system grounding there in the sub panel, because if we did, that would be a ground fault, because some of these currents that would otherwise be going down the neutral would have an alternate pathway down this equipment ground, and that's a no-no. Equipment grounds are not supposed to carry current. And let's talk about bonding. Bonding is just connecting things together. Conductive materials that are likely to become energized shall be connected together. That's bonding. So you bond together your rails and you bond together the frames of your modules. Anything that you think might have a loose wire that could touch it, you bond it. You bond all the metal together. I did an internet search and I came up with something different for bonding. So make sure that you don't let your search engine go for male bonding, or you might go on drinking and a bike ride and get hurt. Let's get into the deepness of the code and start shouting out different letters and numbers. 250.4b1. Grounding of ungrounded systems. What this is saying is that if you have an ungrounded system, you still need to ground it. So we're not dealing too much with ungrounded systems as the NEC goes when we're dealing with our solar systems anymore, because we used to call them ungrounded inverters, but now they're called functional grounded inverters. But let's talk about what an ungrounded system might be. Sometimes a big building might have some voltage coming to it, and we'll say 480 delta ungrounded. So that's a big building. Some big factory might have something like that coming to it. Some big factories could have more than 480 coming to them if you're talking about a giant factory. So you have a factory and it's got 480 delta ungrounded coming to it. That would be ungrounded. Just because something is ungrounded doesn't mean that you don't bond all the metal and things together. So you're going to bond everything together. If you did have a factory that had 480 delta ungrounded and then there was a ground fault, the factory could still keep running, because the ground fault would be a way to just make the system grounded temporarily while there is a ground fault. That is just some things that could potentially happen. Some of the different reasons that we do grounding are limiting of lightning voltages, unintentional contact with high voltage lines. So a high voltage line goes and hits something. We want it to be everything to be grounded together, bonded and grounded. And also we would limit our voltage to ground. Those are different reasons why we ground these systems, even when they're ungrounded. We also ground, of course, our grounded system. Equipment grounding is important. We want to bond all these things together. Equipment enclosures, anything that's metal that could carry current, non-current carrying conductive materials, as it says in 250.4b1, non-current carrying conductive materials enclosing electrical equipment or enclosures shall be connected to earth. Right now what we're doing is we're looking at the IAEI magazine website. And what we can see here is an image of 480 delta. And that's 480 volts, 480 volts, and 480 volts, and it's ungrounded. So none of these are grounded until there's a ground fault. And the ground fault, as it says here in the International Association of Electrical Inspectors magazine, IAEI, it says the first ground fault on ungrounded system accidentally grounds a system. So, there you go. It's like you have a grounded system. But then if you have a second ground fault, that's when there's a problem. So it's not only a ground fault, but a phase-to-phase short circuit. So as you can see, the first fault, it just grounds the system, makes it like a grounded system. It's not something that you would even have to potentially shut the factory down with. So when you have these big factories, you might have engineers that are working on the factory that are experts in this, monitoring things as they're going on. Then what we can see there, it says ground detection indicators are important. Of course, you want to have that. And so there is the second ground fault. And you don't want to have the second ground fault in a system like this. And back to 250.4b1, grounding of ungrounded system. This is grounding, connecting to earth, not bonding, because B2 is going to be bonding. And so some of the things that connecting to earth do for your ungrounded system, it limits lightning voltage, unintentional contact with high voltage lines, limits voltage to ground. So you always ground your system. You always make sure that your things are bonded and grounded. And so let's look at our bonding part. 250.4b2 bonding of ungrounded systems. Non-current carrying conductive materials enclosing electrical equipment or enclosures shall be connected together and to supply equipment. So bonding is connecting everything together. It gives us a low impedance, which is like resistance pathway for ground faults. So when there's a ground fault, we want it to go through quick right there. We want that something to shut off. We want an overcurrent protection device to open up. We don't want some kind of current that takes its time getting through there. We don't want high impedance or like high resistance. Also, another thing is with our bonding of grounded systems is we need them to be capable of carrying the highest ground fault current. And so we're going to look at some of the different tables where we figure out how high the currents are going to be. But that's just about enough of these ungrounded systems, because after the 2014 NEC, once you get into 2017 NEC and beyond, you are not doing ungrounded DC systems. And your AC ungrounded systems are for big time people. So some of you might not be big time yet, but maybe you will be big time working on these big old huge systems. And then you might have to deal with some of this stuff. One of the things that you might have to look out for is if you have a system that you're connecting to. Let's say that the existing building has 277, 480. You can hook up a 480 delta ungrounded inverter to that, but you cannot do the other way around. So if you had a 480 delta building, you can't connect a 277 480 inverter to that, because all of a sudden you would be grounding the building through your inverter, which ain't going to happen. That would be a bad thing to do. And that's kind of a common thing that people run into. So just remember, if you had a ungrounded delta inverter, you could connect to a grounded building or outdoor system. We're going to talk about a main bonding jumper as in 250.24b. And these bonding jumpers, you're bonding neutral to ground somewhere. So this, of course, is for grounded systems. A bonding jumper can be used at each service disconnect enclosure. And we're going to only have one bonding jumper per system. Also, we can bond when we're doing a supply side connection. There's different ways of doing that, and we're going to get deep into bonding neutral to ground on the supply side. We are going to get deep to how you bond neutral to ground when you're doing a supply side connection when we get to 705.11. That's 2020 NEC, or we'll call it 705.12a in the 2017 and earlier versions of the NEC, but they're pretty much the same. And our main bonding jumper, what can it be? According to 240.28, it can be copper, so it can be like a wire. It can be a corrosion-resistant material. It can be a bus bar, and it can even be a screw. So if you look in your main service panel, a lot of times it's a bus bar, and you just see this one bus bar that has bare copper going to it, green wires going to it, and white wires going to it. And that would be where everything is connected together. That's your single point of system grounding, and that's your main bonding jumper. And now on the DC side of the inverter, we don't do that. If you were going back to the 2014 NEC, our main bonding jumper was considered to be a fuse inside the inverter, or sometimes it would be a circuit breaker. There we go, review. Main bonding jumper in the main service panel, your single point of system grounding. But if you were over on the other side of the main breaker there's different theories on if you're doing a supply side connection on the other side of the main breaker. There's different theories on if you can bond it here separately or over here. And we will talk about that in 705.11. We're talking about electricity, and we're talking about electrodes, to be specific, grounding electrodes. No, not those things coming off the side of Frankenstein's head, like these electrodes right there. Those are not grounding electrodes. This is an example of a Home Depot grounding electrode for $13.49. So here we are. Part 3, Article 250, Grounding Electrode System and Grounding Electrode Conductor, 250.50, Grounding Electrode System, 250.52, Grounding Electrodes. And here's what it looks like in the 2017 NEC. Darn, they have nice pictures. Pretty much the same thing. So we can see there's a ground rod, there's a ground ring, there's a concrete encased electrode, electrodes all over the place, even a metal underground water pipe. But you know what kind of pipe you can't do? One that's filled with explosive gas, fossil fuels. Not for the solar people. So if you don't know where to go when they say electrode and you're on a test or you're just in the field and you've got some NEC books, go to 250.50, 50.50, 250.50. Repetition is good for things. So here's some different things. Up top, we have some bonding jumpers. Up top, we have some bus bars that are places where we can bond our neutral to ground and different things like disconnects and things like that. There's a ground rod. A lot of times they are 8 feet long because that's what the NEC says. So there's that ground rod. What you can do is you can take a number 6 wire, see how all these 3 things come together for the low price of $37.76. And we have this wire that's 6 gauge bare copper wire, 25 feet of it. And we can go to the bus bar from that 6 gauge copper wire, or it could just be somewhere in your main service panel that might already have one of these things. But if you have a disconnect, you might have to add one of these things. It's just different what type of system that you're doing. Then you got that number 6 copper, 25 feet of it. Hopefully that's long enough. And you are bringing that to this bolt right there, and you are bolting this onto that 5/8 inch diameter ground rod that's 8 feet long. One of the things about these is they're hard to drive into the ground. We're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later, but you can use this vibrating thing that vibrates it down into the ground. Can I do YouTube right now? Here it is, YouTube. You can watch this on YouTube also. And so there it is, a hammer drill driving in an 8-foot long rod. Oops, the dude hit a rock. What's kind of interesting is there's this type of racking system that I'll show you at a different part of the course where they actually drive stuff into the ground with one of those hammer drills like that. And it is for mounting a PV system. They kind of anchor it down. It's kind of weird. It's kind of cool. 250.52, grounding electrodes connecting to earth. And there's different types, like a ground rod, which we were just looking at. There's a ground plate, which has the same surface area as a ground rod. And I've seen those used a lot in Canada. It's kind of weird. It's a Canadian thing, but it's in the NEC. There's a concrete encased electrode, which is super popular when you're pouring the foundation of a building or a foundation for a big inverter pad. You can just put copper right inside of that concrete, and that connects you to ground. There's a ground ring, which was a famous NABCEP PV installation professional exam question. And you needed to know that it's not smaller than 2 gauge wire and it surrounds a building. Another way of doing it is an underground water pipe or the metal frame of the building. Types of ground rods not allowed: gas pipes, of course, gas explodes, and aluminum, or as they say that in England, aluminium. And aluminum, it will corrode. Then this NEC thing tells us how to install stuff. The nerve of them. But if you're going to install a rod, ground rod, a pipe, or a plate electrode, you want to install it, if practicable, below the moisture level. And it must be free of coatings like paint, of course, because that's not going to be very conductive. Paint is not very conductive. Supplemental electrodes are not required if resistance to ground is 25 ohms or less. Sometimes you can even measure the resistance to ground. Supplemental electrodes must be at least 6 feet apart. There's some AHJs, authorities having jurisdiction, where they require supplemental electrodes. That might have to do with how conductive your earth is. In wet places, the earth is very conductive. In dry places, no matter how many electrodes you put in the ground, it won't be very conductive, and it's almost kind of useless. Like, say if you lived on a rock, what would you do? That rock is not very conductive unless it's a rock of gold. So, installing the ground rod. The rod, it's got to be 8 feet into the earth, 45-degree angle if you hit the rock bottom, as we're going to see in a picture in a second, and buried at least 30 inches. And here's a good picture of what we're talking about. There it is, 8 feet down. If you can do that, that's the best way to do that. However, if you start hitting rocks, you can go at an angle. And if that doesn't even work, you can just dig a hole 2.5 feet down and go sideways. And 2.5 feet just happens to be 30 inches. What a coincidence. Ground rings. We bring this up because it's on the PVIP exam sometimes, and you just should know where to look it up in the NEC. So look at your 250.50, go a little bit further, maybe 3 further. Installation of a grounding electrode, and we're talking about a ground ring, should be buried at least 30 inches, not smaller than a 2-gauge wire, and you need at least 20 feet of wire. And then we have 250.54, and that is auxiliary grounding electrodes. And we argue about that over and over in 690 throughout the years. And these auxiliary grounding electrode conductors are permitted to be connected to equipment grounding conductors. Some people don't like that. It's like off the roof of your PV system, you just hook up to the rail or something and then bring it down to the ground. It's almost like that. Or your equipment grounding conductor up on the roof, bringing it down to the ground. And it was required to do that in the 2014 National Electrical Code, but then they made it less required because people were boxing over it at the NEC meetings. And it's also not required to comply with electrode bonding requirements. And so that's this weird auxiliary grounding electrode. So just in case you don't know English, like I don't sometimes, auxiliary, the adjective, is providing supplementary or additional help and support. Or if you want to use the noun form of auxiliary, a person, thing providing supplementary or additional help or support. I guess we're talking about a noun because it is a thing. It is a thing. It is a grounding electrode. An auxiliary grounding electrode is a thing. It's a noun. And then we find ourselves at 250.66. This is a place where you might have to go if you're installing the AC system. So if you're just a residential installer, it's already there on the house. You don't have to worry about this. But if you're building the house or if you're doing a solar farm, then you might have to figure this out. This is the AC grounding electrode conductor. How big does that thing have to be? And it's based on the largest ungrounded conductor. And then you will have to look at this table. And so if your wire is a 1 or a 1/0, then it needs to be at least a number 6 copper. It never can be smaller than a number 8. And that would be if your largest ungrounded service entrance conductor was a 2 or smaller. And then you can see that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. When we talk about supply side connections, we're going to look at 705.11d for bonding and grounding with supply side connections, and that should be in accordance with 250.92b. Let's take a look here. 250.92b, method of bonding at service. Bonding jumpers meeting the requirements of this article shall be used around impaired connections such as reducing washers or oversized concentric or eccentric knockouts. Standard lock nuts or bushings shall not be the only means for bonding required by this section, but shall be permitted installed to make mechanical connections to the raceway. So sometimes when you just connect pipe to a box, it can ground things, but when you're bonding to a service or doing a supply side connection, it might not do it just right, especially when you have these extra knockouts. It's sort of like a knockout within a knockout. See what Google says? We've got like a knockout within a knockout. There it is, knockout within a knockout. So you can select which size you're going to use. And if you still have like extra rings that you could have knocked out right there, there's one right there. And if you got extra ones that you could have used and you didn't use it, then it doesn't work so well for grounding and bonding. So we can see that electrical continuity at service equipment, service raceways, and service conductor enclosures shall be ensured by one of the following methods. One of these 4, bonding equipment to the grounded service conductor in a manner provided with 250.8. And you know, one of the things about the NEC, then I could go to 250.8 and it's going to bring me somewhere else. And pretty soon, maybe you would have gone in a concentric circle. Connections using threaded couplings or listed threaded hubs or enclosures, if made up wrench tight, So you got to look out for your threads and things like that, and make sure that the threads are right. Threaded couplings and connectors, if made up of tight metal raceways and metal-clad cables. Other listed devices. So we just need to make sure that we're using devices that are good enough. But a lot of times, to bond it, you can just use like a piece of copper. That's a pretty good way to bond at the surface, a piece of copper. Supply side bonding jumper now. We got to look at that when we're doing a supply side connection. Supply side bonding jumper sized in 250.102. And here it is, 250.102. And we can see that there's a table down here. And it's showing you like this service largest ungrounded conductor, and kind of like that table that we were just looking at, like 250.66. But we can see over here, if it's 2 or smaller, hey, it's an 8. It's like the same size. So just kind of check that out too for doing a supply side bonding jumper. And recall, we're just starting with this course, and we haven't even got to 690 and 705 yet, where a lot of the stuff is for this course. So we will look back on some of this stuff again. Now here's a place where we don't have to look much anymore, but we used to, and it's 250.166. It's sizing your DC grounding electrode conductor, and a lot of times we would just have to make that an 8 because it couldn't be smaller than an 8. That was the rule. The 8 would have been the smallest. However, we don't have to do that anymore, and we're going to learn about that in Article 690, why we don't need a DC grounding electrode conductor, with some very small exceptions. So what would be these exceptions? You're doing some little small off-grid ground mount thing like a water pump. That would possibly require a DC grounding electrode conductor, or just some system that's only DC that doesn't have any alternating current. So not one of these big time things that most of us are trying to do, where we're connecting big buildings to the grid and energy storage systems and big off-grid systems, things like that. We're talking about a lot of these systems that would require a DC grounding electrode conductor would be things that are under a kilowatt, not something that we would be dealing too much with. It kind of brings me back to one of these memory techniques. 250.66 is your AC grounding electrode conductor. And then we put a 1 before the 66. 250.166 is the DC grounding electrode conductor. And then we put a 22 where the 66 goes. That's 250.122, and that's how we size our equipment grounding conductors. Sometimes memory techniques like that, just remembering 66, 166, and then 122, if we could remember those things, we can kind of get to things kind of quick. And if you don't even remember what they are, if there's only 3 of them, you could go to all 3 of them. And here it is, table 250.122. This is how to size our AC and our DC equipment grounding conductors. So if your overcurrent protection device is 15 amps or less, then you're required to use at least a 14 gauge wire. You will see that many people use a 10 gauge wire when they're using a 15 amp overcurrent protection device, because the AHJ doesn't always understand the NEC perfectly, and they might just want to see a 10 gauge wire for an equipment grounding conductor when all your other conductors are 10 gauge wire, and they're just really used to that. But it would work. In fact, in theory, you could have 100 10 gauge wires running off of your roof to 15 amp fuses down below, going to a bigger inverter, and have one single puny little 14 gauge equipment grounding conductor going with those wires, and that would be compliant with the National Electrical Code, and that would be a big enough wire to carry the signal that there's a ground fault, but probably nobody would do that. But it would be compliant with the National Electrical Code. Most of the time you're dealing with PV source circuits, if you are dealing with PV source circuits that are 15 amps or 20 amps as far as the overcurrent protection device size goes. To size the overcurrent protection device, as we will learn when we get to Article 690, you take the short circuit current that's written on the back of the module, and that's just for PV, you multiply times 1.56. Then you round up to the next common overcurrent protection device size, and you'll get that 15 amps or the 20 amps after multiplying short circuit current times 1.56. And that's because most of the time we're using solar cells where the current would be less than 20 amps divided by 1.56 or 15 amps divided by 1.56. And also, though, you might have circuits that are 60 amps, 100 amps or more for your AC circuits or bigger DC circuits, and you might be doing some of this. Another thing is you don't use 1.56 if you're using DC to DC converters. And what's the other name for a DC to DC converter? What do you call it? optimizer if you're optimistic. And if you don't have an overcurrent protection device for the 2020 National Electrical Code and the 2017 National Electrical Code, then you would base the assumed overcurrent protection device size on short circuit current times 1.56, and that is for PV source circuits and PV output circuits. The only time that you do 1.56 is for source circuits and output circuits. That's things connected directly to wild PV. Wild PV is PV that gets more current as it gets brighter, and if you shined a bunch of mirrors on something, it would get more current. But if you shined a bunch of mirrors on a PV module connected to a DC to DC converter, that DC to DC converter will electronically limit the current. So therefore, you don't have a short circuit current and a 1.56 with a DC to DC converter. Are you ready to get interesting? So the NABCEP PV installation professional exam wants you to know the photoelectric effect. So there it is, no big deal. Einstein said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. That's how I try to run my classes. I try not to go too much over people's heads. I try to make things as simple as possible, like this photoelectric effect equation. So there it is. You got it? Okay, that's going to be on the test totally for sure. Yeah, right. And this is just something else that's kind of interesting. One time I was doing a talk in Shanghai, and I was in a hotel, and in the hotel I was reading a magazine, and it said that another hotel in town had the room where Einstein was when he learned that he won the Nobel Prize. And you know that Einstein won the Nobel Prize in 1922 for a paper that he wrote in 1905, but it took them a while to award him the prize. Most of the money went to his wife. How do I know that? I like to read books on Einstein, and I actually used to know his granddaughter. We had our birthday parties together. Her birthday was the day before mine. Rest in peace. And this is the room that Einstein was in. So I rented the room. It cost twice as much. And you know what I did? I found a follicle underneath that old beaten up chair right there that Einstein used to be sitting on. And I have cloned Einstein. Yep, that's right. He's in my back pocket right now. I'm pretty good at cloning. I've learned that because I am NABCEP certified, just like you probably will be next week. Isn't it great to know right away if you pass the exam? So many people for so many years took over a month to figure out if they passed the exam, and everybody thought they failed. Now people learn right away, and that makes people a lot happier. And this just about takes us to the end of Article 250, which is kind of a huge article in the National Electrical Code. It's something that the top experts argue about all the time because I think it's just not an exact science. So don't get too worried about understanding grounding and bonding. You got plenty of time. And when people act like they really know, they're just fooling you. So act like you know, and pretty soon you'll just be as smart as everyone else. And that brings us to the end of the video. Heatspring Advanced PV, Article 250, Grounding and Bonding. Woo! And this video was brought to you by the Astor House Hotel, Shanghai, China.